Good evening. Thank you for coming and welcome to the Getty Center. My name is Wim de Wit. I'm the head of the Department of Architecture and Contemporary Art here at the Getty Research Institute. The Research Institute's director, Thomas Gatekens, would have loved to be here, but he came back with a terrible cold from Europe and not wanting to infect you all. He did a wise thing and stayed home, but he does send his apologies, and so you'll have to do with me instead here. I'm extremely pleased that you're all here, even though there are so many other architecture-related events happening in our city within the context of Pacific Standard Time Presents Modern Architecture in Los Angeles, which is a Getty-funded series of exhibitions and public programs taking place in the city right now. And if you do not know about it yet, there are brochures outside. There's also lots of information on the website, pacificstandardtimepresents.org, so please take a look. So I know you had to make choices, and I'm sure that you will not regret that you came to what promises to be a very interesting lecture today. Before I introduce our speaker, I should ask you all to turn off your cell phones so that Christopher will not be interrupted by not so nice sounds. Tonight's speaker, Christopher Hawthorne, is well known to all of you, and in a way he does not need any introduction. I do not have to tell you, for example, that he's the architectural critic of the Los Angeles Times, that he has been in that position since 2005, and that he has also written for Slate, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Yorker, and the Architectural Record. You probably also know that he graduated from Yale University, where he studied political science and architectural history. And I'm very sure that you all already know that he has composed some excellent series of articles for the Times, especially his essays on books written on the history of Los Angeles since the 19th century, and also his pieces on our city's boulevards. So let me therefore tell you something that I think you do not know, and that that Christopher Hawthorne himself is probably not going to tell you about tonight. A little less than a year ago, the fine art dealer Stuart Dannenberg, who's sitting right there with his wife, brought to my attention that the very well-known architectural critic, Louise Huxtable, was looking for a good home for her papers. I think you can imagine that when this call came, I was very excited. And I was, of course, aware of Miss Huxtable's work as critic of the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, and knew that this archive would be an excellent addition to our already considerable collection of critics' papers. The problem was, however, that at that moment, and it was still, I think it was late August or something like that, right? The weather was still nice. I was under some very tight deadlines for work that we needed to finish for our exhibition, Overdrive, LA Constructs the Future, 1940 to 1990, an exhibition that's upstairs here, and I hope you already have seen it. Even if you've seen it, you still go back, and if you have not seen it, you definitely go see it. There are still about 3.5 weeks left until July 21. But because of those constraints, I had to say to Stuart that I would not be able to go to the East Coast to see the archive until early November. Once I could finally go, and you'll all be glad to hear, we waited until the day after the elections. We all could do our civic duties. We spent 2 amazing days in a very cold warehouse in Marblehead, Massachusetts, and saw an archive that's extremely rich in information about how Miss Huxtable worked as a critic, and it also shows how loved she was by the readers of the New York Times, thousands of whom wrote to her over the years. At the end of each of these days, we went to Louise Huxtable's house and warmed ourselves with tea, apple cake, and wonderful conversations. At some point, we started to talk about architectural criticism. And Ms. Huxtable said that the best architecture critic at the moment works for the Los Angeles Times. And she was, of course, talking about Christopher Hawthorne. In her opinion, nobody else could even come close to him. She then added that if the Getty wanted her archive, and if we could come to an agreement about the acquisition, Hawthorne should be granted the privilege to announce his acquisition first, even before the New York Times and Wall Street Journals, and these are newspapers for which he had worked for many years. Unfortunately, these things did not work out exactly the way we were thinking about it at that time. as less than 2 weeks after A. Louise Huxtable had signed the agreement transferring her archives to us, she passed away. Instead of a celebratory press release about the archive, we had to prepare a somber announcement of her passing, and we did not need any competition about who would be allowed to print that news first. It's our plan that this lecture tonight, a lecture on A. Louise Huxtable, will be the beginning of an annual A. Louise Huxtable lecture series. I and neither anybody else in the Getty has any idea yet who will be the future speakers, but it is a great honor for us that this first lecture will be given by Christopher Hawthorne. Please welcome with me to this podium tonight's speaker, the best architecture critic in the country, Christopher Hawthorne, whose lecture is entitled What a Critic Sees, A. Louise Huxtable and Her Legacy. Christopher.
Good evening, everybody. Can everybody hear me in the back? Thank you, Vim, for that terrific and very kind introduction. As you can see, I've changed the title ever so slightly in the spirit of revision and concision. Let me thank a number of other people here at the Getty, starting, of course, with James Cuno, Vim, as I mentioned, Christopher Alexander, Sue Kang for all of her help, Amy Hood, and others, quite a few others, in fact. And thanks to all of you for being here this evening and being part of this audience. I'd also like to acknowledge and express my gratitude to Stuart and Beverly Dennenberg, and acknowledge the members of my family. My wife Rachel is here, and my colleagues as well. Vim mentioned that this is the beginning, and he went on to say the beginning of an annual series. It is also this talk that I'm about to give offered in that same spirit. It is not meant to be a definitive assessment on Ada Louise's career, a definitive take on her work and her legacy, but it's meant to suggest, I think, a couple of things. One, what we all, as Angelenos and Southern Californians, have gained by the fact that her archive, her papers, will now be here at the Getty and in Southern California. And also, I think, to begin to think about influence and the way that Ada Louise built her authority over time, and I'll talk about that in a range of ways. So, with that said, what would Ada Louise do? What would Ada Louise say? What would Ada Louise write? These are phrases I find myself mumbling to myself from time to time as I struggle to finish an essay or meet a deadline. Perhaps because so many of her reviews show an astonishing lack of struggle. They seem to arrive at conclusions, however bold or separate from conventional wisdom, inexorably with a kind of natural force like gravity. She always seemed to be writing downhill. And that is perhaps an indication of why she found such kinship with architects like Richard Meyer, to pick one obvious example, the architect of the Getty, who never strayed from modernism, because her mind worked the same way, as spare, powerful, ornament-free modernism of the purest variety. It sought not to complicate, but to clarify, to minimize verbal and intellectual clutter. And that makes her example for a working critic a terribly hard one to confront sometimes. I found myself mumbling those phrases, in fact, this morning as I worked to trim and revise my own overlong review of the controversial and much delayed architecture exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art, which used to be called A New Sculpturalism and is now called, well, it's not entirely clear what it's called. This show and the cast of characters at the center of it, Frank Gehry and Tom Main and Jeffrey Deitch, Ada Louise would no doubt have had a field day. I asked myself, what would Ada Louise write, not just to help me order my own thinking, but also selfishly in a way, because There continue to be buildings and exhibitions and controversies like that one now swirling around MoCA that I'm dying to read her take on. But in talking tonight about Ada Louise's career and her approach to criticism in architectural history and her legacy, and what it means to have her papers here, as I mentioned, in LA, clear across the country from the city which she was always so indelibly linked. I want to begin instead with a different question, no less insistent, and that question is, kicked a building lately? That question was the title of Ada Louise's second book of collected reviews and essays published in 1976, and the title referred in part to Ada Louise's willingness to take on or take down buildings directly without hesitation and to often devastating effect. Her talent for zingers, for terrifically effective one-liners, came up again and again at the recent memorial tribute for her in New York, where I was lucky enough to say a few words about her influence on my own work. And we were reminded at that memorial tribute about what she had to say about Edward Durell Stone's Kennedy Center in Washington. The building, she wrote, is a national tragedy. It is a cross between a concrete candy box and a marble sarcophagus in which the art of architecture lies buried. And poor Edward Durell Stone, or Ed Stone, as Ada Louise liked to call him, stripping him in his name of the frippery she so disliked in his architecture. He came in for rather frequent abuse of that kind. She called his museum at 2 Columbus Circle in New York, quote, a die-cut Venetian palazzo on lollipops, unquote, which meant that it was forever condemned to be known as the Lollipop Building. And she didn't stop there. She added, the building is by Edward Durell Stone, an architect who rejects the provocative, puzzling, and sometimes brutal aspects of today's architecture in much the same way. No traditionalist, he simply prefers a less controversial idiom, avoids the more provoking and stimulating experiments, smooths off the rugged edges, and pads well with wall-to-wall luxury. And I wrote a piece about that review a couple of years ago and about its influence in New York and elsewhere. And I wrote, nobody can emasculate an architect with serious and yet above the fray panache, quite like Huxtable. These phrases, avoids the more provoking and stimulating experiments, smooths off the rugged edges, pads well. Every critic dreams of being able to strike such a series of blows, offhanded and punishing at the same time, an uppercut delivered while stifling a yawn. And then there was the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden on the Mall in Washington by Gordon Bunshaft, which she called, quote, born dead neo-penitentiary modern. Its mass is not so much aggressive or overpowering as merely leaden. And there's another slightly better view of the same building, which has, I think, a few more redeeming qualities in my view than Ada Louise would have admitted. This is a picture of the interior courtyard by Ezra Stoller. And these kicks, this potent streak in Ada Louise's writing, continued right through the end of her life and career, right up through the final review that she wrote of a proposed redesign and modernization by Norman Foster and his firm Foster and Partners for the main branch of the New York Public Library. In a review entitled Undertaking Its Destruction and published on December 3rd of last year, just a little more than a month before she died, she wrote, "This is a plan devised out of a profound ignorance of or willful disregard for not only the library's original concept and design, but also the folly of altering its meaning and mission and compromising its historical and architectural integrity. You don't update a masterpiece. Modernization may be the most dangerously misused word in the English language." And here's another view of the Foster plan, which is now being modified in part to address the concerns raised in that final piece. Ada Louise never shied away from this reading of her work, as incomplete as it could be. She was, that she was in part a master at delivering these knockout blows to important but flawed pieces of architecture. And in fact, in reading again through so much of her work, now know what I can say to people who ask, as a lot of people continue to do, why I was so harsh in my review of this building, the Perot Museum of Science and Nature, which looks really terrific in photography, doesn't it? Which is one of I think the points of my review, that it doesn't live up to its power as an image in a magazine when you visit it in person. So now when people ask how I could be so nasty to this piece of architecture, I will simply quote Ada Louise, who wrote that she saved, this is in the introduction to Kick to Building lately, she wrote that she saved her classic kicks, as she called them, for, quote, those monumental structures of high visibility and high aspirations that should represent the American architectural genius at its best and have failed to do so. And I would say that expresses nearly perfectly why I was compelled to write the review I did of the Perot Museum in Dallas, which is by Morphosis Architects. But there was a good deal more, of course, to Ada Louise and her authority than those barbs and those quotable put-downs, as entertaining as they are to revisit. Because, of course, if they become too quotable and too glib a picture of her career, threaten to become a critic's version of this sort of hyper-photogenic building as something that only works in the single image or the single soundbite. And I want to be careful this evening not to pigeonhole Ada Louise that way. What she meant by kicking a building was also, of course, the sense of kicking the tires, of looking at a building up close and touching it and testing it against her own movement, writing in great detail about how a building was put together physically and conceptually. And that broader definition of architecture criticism and of Ada Louise's legacy is really what I want to focus on this evening on the way toward finishing up with some thoughts about the questions her archive might help us answer, the mysteries it might help solve, and the secrets it might yield. And the title of my talk this evening comes from an artwork by Jasper Johns called The Critic Sees, which he made the first version of in 1964. And it's a brick. If you can't see it, it's a brick with glasses, and in place of eyes, there is a mouth in each eye. And I borrow that title in something, admittedly, of an ironic spirit, since Johns wasn't particularly fond of art critics, and indeed many scholars have interpreted the point of the piece, perhaps, as being that critics can't see without opening their mouths. I think it also means that critics really start seeing when they start talking or writing, to be slightly more charitable about it, or use language as a way of seeing on the way to writing. And there's the John's piece later on the cover of Artforum. And 4 years later, as a kind of aside, he made a follow-up piece, which is called The Critic Smiles, with teeth instead of bristles on the toothbrush. So the question is not just what did Ada Louise write, but how did she see, how did she choose to look, and in turn, how did those choices affect her criticism and also her work as an architectural historian? And in that sense, the Jasper Johns piece, or at least its title, was irresistible for me because it allowed me to also to frame and talk about what I see as a fellow critic when I look at her work. And perhaps most important of all, what other critics and architects and scholars and readers may see in the years ahead with her papers coming here to the Getty. As I said at the Memorial Tribute in New York, I want to concentrate on the Ada Louise of the future along the lines that I just discussed. And that means, in part, to introduce her work to those of you who may not be so familiar with her career, and also suggest what this archive might mean for Los Angeles and for future generations of scholars, as I mentioned. And I think her story really does have broad appeal outside of criticism and outside, indeed, of architecture, because it's the story, really, of how she made herself and then made architecture criticism first valuable and then indispensable to the New York Times and then to the wider culture. And it's in that sense that I think all of us practicing architecture critics really owe her the most. It is the story, in fact, of how power is forged and how influence grows. And at the risk of sounding like a little like Malcolm Gladwell, it's a story that should interest anybody who wants to understand how to make themselves and their own work, I think, indispensable in the same way. It is also the story of a woman gathering prominence in two fields, architecture and journalism both, that were dominated by men at the time. And in fact, this opportunity to think anew about Ada Louise's influence comes at a time when the architecture profession is in the midst of an important debate about gender and collaboration, and how credit in architecture is both claimed and bestowed, and I'll mention a little bit more about that later on. I referred at the start to the idea that Ada Louise was, for much of her career, dedicated to the ideas and ideals of modernism, but what is remarkable about her rise as a critic is that as she was gaining authority, modernism, that bulwark for her in some ways, was losing authority in the 1960s, in the 1970s, and then into the 1980s. And of course, as she was gaining authority in those same years, particularly in the 1960s, the authority in general was in question throughout American culture. And that story, how she forged her own place and influence and the variety of ways that authority begins to shape how we think of her, that's really at the heart of my remarks this evening. And to get to that heart, to touch on those themes, I think a certain amount of biographical background is probably necessary. Ada Louise Landman was born on March 14th, 1921, to Leah Rosenthal Landman and Dr. Michael Lewis Landman. She grew up in a fairly impressive Beaux-Arts apartment building, the St. Urban at 89th Street and Central Park West. She studied architectural history at Hunter College and later at New York University's Institute of Fine Arts. And she was a student when she met her future husband, the industrial designer Garth Huxtable at Bloomingdale's, where she was selling modern furniture at a special sale of winning designs that had come out of MoMA's organic design competition. He was furnishing his bachelor apartment, and I sold him a piece of furniture, and he got me, is how she put it to the New York Observer. She was hired as assistant curator of architecture and design at the Museum of Modern Art, where she worked from 1946 to 1950. Then a Fulbright fellowship took her to Italy in the early 1950s, and when she returned to New York, she turned her research, begun in Italy, on the Italian architect and engineer Pier Luigi Nervi into her first book, which was published in 1960. And she was by then writing for a number of magazines and had begun work on what she imagined would be a 6-part history of New York City architecture. And while finishing up the first volume, she was recruited, or began to be recruited, by the New York Times. And there had been others who had been covering architecture. One of them, who had been doing so regularly, had just announced that she was getting married to the architect Eero Saarinen, and her editors decided it would be a conflict of interest to allow her to continue doing so. And so the door was opened for Ada Louise. I went in all dressed up with my clippings, is how she described it to the radio host Leonard Lopate in 2008. And I remember saying to the editors, all you've been doing is printing the developers' PR releases in your real estate section. You have nobody covering this very important field. They would simply print the puff pieces, she added in another interview, and they would show architects' renderings, and I would get so upset. I would say, that terrible thing? I do believe in entitlement. I do believe we are all consumers of architecture, and that we are all entitled to something good, and that this garbage was being foisted on us by developers. I came out from the belief that architecture is a social art. It's a great art, but it's a social art. It has to work. It has to serve people. In the first few years of her tenure, she was writing relatively few critical pieces, and her approach was very different from the one that we came to associate with her later work for The Times, The Wall Street Journal, and elsewhere. There had been well-known architecture critics before, of course, including Montgomery Schuyler in various New York publications around 1900, and then Louis Mumford, of course, at The New Yorker. And in fact, Alan Tempko had arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle as its architecture critic in 1961. But to a large extent, Ada Louise was inventing the position of full-time daily newspaper architecture critic as she went along. And in some ways, it was a rocky start. She was asked in her early years at the Times to write short news items on buildings before she was given the chance to review them. The paper's policy for criticism was generally that something wasn't worthy of review until it had been noted in the news pages. And when it came to news of architecture, she was essentially the only one to write those pieces. And then she'd write short reviews in the daily edition during the week, often revisiting a project in the Sunday paper. But by the late 1960s, she established herself as a critic with an understanding of New York politics and real estate, as well as one with an interest in preservation, of course, following the 1963 demolition of the old Penn Station, as well as an interest in planning. But what has surprised me in going back through her reviews is how often she wrote about aesthetics and form as well, and about the careers of individual architects and firms. It was really the breadth of her work, along with its toughness and directness and unmatched ability, as we've seen, to turn a critical phrase, that had established her by 1967 and 1968 as not only the leading architecture critic in the country, but one of the leading critical voices in New York writing about any field. And that growing sense of authority was confirmed when she was awarded the first ever Pulitzer Prize in criticism, a new category for the Pulitzers in 1970. And this is a picture of Ada Louise from that year with Arthur Sulzberger Jr., the publisher of the paper known as Punch. And this picture occasioned a terrific line on Twitter from my fellow critic Alexandra Lang, who has written, I think, really superbly about Ada Louise and her work. She called this my favorite picture of Ada Louise Huxtable, just waiting for Punch to stop talking. Ada Louise's growing authority was reflected in other ways too, not just with the letters from architects and lay readers alike praising her work or arguing with it that fill her archive, but also in pop culture. She was the subject of two separate cartoons in the New Yorker magazine. This, the more famous of the two, from 1968, and if you can't read what it says at the bottom, there are two men at a construction site, and one says to the other, Ada Louise Huxtable already doesn't like it. And in fact, Ada Louise not only had a framed copy of the original of this cartoon, but a pillow embroidered with its caption. That's, I think, the dream, the ultimate dream for any architecture critic. And so this cartoon, again, it's 1968. It's 5 years after Ada Louise was essentially brought in and asked to invent her own position and create her own authority. And already, in just 5 years' time, she is getting this sort of reaction in the popular culture. She had all by herself made architecture and even architecture criticism central to the discussion in New York and beyond. How had she done that? By the force of her rhetoric, of course, as we've heard, her hard work and her punishingly high standards for herself, by her timing, her ambition, and perhaps most of all, her remarkably clear and assured prose style. In 1973, she became the first woman appointed to a spot on the New York Times editorial board, but she continued to write Sunday pieces on architecture quite regularly, even as a very young Paul Goldberger, then just 23 or 24, was appointed the architecture critic for the Daily New York Times. And she went on in the rest of the 70s to do double duty, writing those Sunday pieces and writing editorials for the Times. And as she put it, she began to chafe in that position on the editorial board, having to recruit all of those other very smart and very ambitious members around to her way of thinking after having gotten used to having this kind of authority and autonomy all by herself. And so in 1982, when she was awarded one of the first MacArthur Genius grants, she leapt at the chance to leave the New York Times and begin working as an independent scholar. And in the 80s and into the 90s, she continued to publish books and books with equally memorable titles, including Goodbye History, Hello Hamburger in 1986, and a really terrific book about architecture and illusion called The Unreal America. And by the 1990s, she was also writing regularly for the New York Review of Books. And then, as an incredible coda to this already long and remarkably distinguished career, she accepted an offer in 1997 to become the architecture critic at the Wall Street Journal, a job she would hold, as I mentioned before, until the end of her life. And her contract there called for her to contribute just 6 pieces a year, most years, though she often wrote more. But that light contractual expectation meant that she could try out what I see as a new approach to criticism, and one that should be, I think, influential in its own right, one that really suited the authority that she'd built up over the course of her career. No longer was she required to write those short news items about buildings before given the authority to review them, as she'd done in the early years at the New York Times. She could really pick and choose her topics and decide just when the time was right to weigh in. Often I would do things because I thought I should do them, out of a sense of responsibility, she said in an interview after taking the Wall Street Journal position, referring to those earlier years at the New York Times. Now my philosophy is, look, you young people, it's your responsibility. I'm going to do what I want to do, which meant write about what she wanted to write about and when. And she was working, as I mentioned, all the way up until very close to her death in January at age 91. And so the archive, in extending to include this work at the Wall Street Journal, covers more than 50 years of work. And I've spent a tiny bit of time in the archive so far, and I really look forward to spending more. And I can say that even just pulling the file on the MacArthur Award was incredibly fascinating and educational. I didn't realize that Ada Louise had actually been a consultant helping the MacArthur Foundation put together that award program, and in something of a Dick Cheney move, they ended up giving her one of the first awards. So if that file, which is one of several hundred, is any indication, there's an incredibly rich archive. And then to see her letters nominating other folks for the MacArthur and discussing contemporary architects and criticism, it's fascinating just in that one little sliver of the archive. And I'm, of course, really, really curious to find out the extent to which the files show the particulars of her writing process, as I'm sure they will, the reporting she carried out, and I think we all forget how much good criticism, forceful criticism, is based on really detailed and strong reporting about her revision process. But I'm more interested, frankly, in thinking about the archive as a way, as I said before, to answer or at least dig into some key questions about her legacy, and I think try to push the study of architecture and architecture criticism forward. And these questions include, to begin with, a number related to gender, to sexual politics, to the notion of collaboration, in architecture. As I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, we're in a moment now in architecture where there's a really, I think, productive and long overdue conversation about those issues, now focusing on whether Denise Scott Brown, seen here with her husband and partner Robert Venturi, ought to be honored for her contribution to the really influential practice that they have maintained together for several decades, and focusing in even more detail on the 1991 Pritzker Prize, which was given to Robert Venturi and not to Denise Scott Brown. And in the years since, the Pritzker has been awarded to collaborative pairs, including Herzog and de Meuron, the Swiss firm, and more recently the Japanese firm Sana, which is made up of a male and female founder, not married in their case. And so this discussion is really a timely one, and it makes, I think, us think of the archive in a different way, because Ada Louise Huxtable was on the Pritzker jury in 1991 that decided to give that award to Robert Venturi and not to Denise Scott Brown. And to the extent that we can find in the archive that communication about that decision between the Pritzker jurors, it will, I think, be very helpful in shedding some light on the thinking at the time about those issues, about gender, about collaboration in architecture. So that's the first example. The second is the ranch house. Ada Louise, late in her career, was working on what, by all accounts, was a very ambitious look at the history of the ranch house in American architecture. And here's an image of a house by Cliff May. And that is another way that having this archive here in Los Angeles, I think, will propel some really significant research in thinking, given how eloquently and how often Ada Louise wrote about residential architecture and its connection to American culture. There's a great deal to be learned from her thoughts and her research on this ranch house project. There's the question also of Ada Louise's relationship to postmodernism. And I mentioned that she was, in many ways, particularly early in her career, a dedicated modernist, and there were architects whom she supported who were themselves dedicated modernists who she never grew disloyal to, including Richard Meyer, as I said. But the central, the heart of her career, the heart of the period when she was writing with the most authority was, as I said, precisely that period when modernism and its authority was being called into question, and architects like Philip Johnson were beginning to produce what we now call postmodern buildings, like the AT&T Center with its Chippendale top in New York. And in fact, Ada Louise has referred to this building as one of the very few most significant that she ever wrote about, although she wrote about it quite negatively at the time that it opened. And so that question of what she called her ambivalence, she began a terrific review on Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown by asking whether a critic is allowed to be ambivalent. And given the forcefulness of so many of her reviews, many of which I've quoted, that question, to put that question about ambivalence at the beginning of a review as opposed to a question like kicked a building lately, I think reflected how much her own certainty was beginning to be shaken by the way that the discussion about modernism and what might follow it was unfolding in the 1970s and into the 1980s. So to see, to the extent that the archive will reveal her own questions about her own certainty, her own feelings about this great shift in the power structure in architecture and the way that critics wrote about it, will be fascinating to see. And then the question, perhaps a central one, what it means that her archive will be here in Los Angeles and here at the Getty, which already contains, I think it's important to note, already holds the archive in large part of Rainer Banham and Herbert Muschamp, who followed Ada Louise and Paul Goldberger as the architecture critic at the New York Times. And of course, Ada Louise's relationship with this institution was long-standing. She was on the committee that helped choose Richard Meyer as the architect and that helped shape the design of the complex as it unfolded. And so it was not a shock that her archive wound up here, but I think to a lot of New Yorkers it was a great surprise. And let me repeat something I said at the memorial tribute. I know that some New Yorkers are distressed that her papers are not in the city that she was so closely associated with or close by. And certainly the speculation was that the archive would be somewhere in New York City or perhaps at Yale in New Haven. That might be the furthest afield from New York that it would wind up. And I can understand that feeling, but her influence, already so strong and meaningful for so many people in New York, is now poised to spread dramatically over space as well as time, as her work and her legacy attract new readers and scholars and essentially gain a second base of operations on the West Coast. Maybe this is one advantage, finally, I said, that we architecture critics have over the buildings we write about, that we and our work are mobile, that our influence can radiate out into the world from many places at once. And I certainly believe that to be the case for Ada Louise. The final question I have is, as I hinted earlier, about her working method late in her career, and this is really what I'm most curious about, and the way she deployed that influence that we've been talking about, that she had built up over so many years. And the notion of looking at that later work now can't, for me, be separated from the way that her pieces for the Wall Street Journal would affect and influence me when I was trying to make my own way as a young critic. She became the Wall Street Journal's architecture critic, as I said, in 1997, just as I was beginning in my mid-20s to write about architecture full-time and trying to make a living doing it. And fairly quickly in that time, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, as she was writing for the Wall Street Journal, fairly quickly I would establish a pattern emerging when some architectural news would break or a prominent piece of architecture would open. All of us architecture critics and writers would stumble over each other to be first, to publish the first review, to get the news out there more quickly than our colleagues and rivals. And then that sort of frenzy would subside, and a couple of weeks would pass, maybe a month, sometimes 6 weeks would pass, and then a piece by Ada Louise would appear in the Wall Street Journal. And it would cut to the heart of the matter in a way that I think had all of us going back to reassess our own reviews, and in fact the haste with which we produced them often. This happened most notably and most reliably with coverage of the machinations and power plays surrounding the rebuilding process at the World Trade Center site in New York. And this image shows one of the latest versions of the Daniel Libeskind master plan with the One World Trade Tower, now the work of David Childs and not Daniel Libeskind at left, and the memorial by Michael Arad and Peter Walker in the foreground. And it happened over and over in that coverage that we, again, would race to be first and say what some bit of news meant, what it meant that Daniel Libeskind's master plan had been compromised yet again, or to complain about some claim that the developer Larry Silverstein was making on the site. And then time would pass again, and then a piece by Ada Louise would appear clarifying, I think, so many of the crucial issues. And this is really a subject that it was perfect for her. It was right in her wheelhouse. I think in great contrast to Herbert Mouchamp, who was the critic at the New York Times at that point. Herbert had many virtues as a critic. He was a sort of confessional poet of architectural criticism. He wrote, I think very beautifully, often very poetically, about his own life, his own reaction to buildings, his own place in architecture, culture. I think never more eloquently than in writing about that lollipop building at 2 Columbus Circle that Ada Louise had dismissed so memorably, and in arguing in one of Herbert's final pieces, in fact, for the New York Times Magazine, a really lengthy and meaningful piece that I would encourage you to read if you don't know it. A piece in which Herbert argued that Ada Louise had a too limited view of the value of a building like that and the way that it had operated for him and what it meant for gay men in New York at a certain point in New York history and culture meant that its value as a piece of architecture had to be defined more broadly. But what Herbert wasn't cut out for was to write about the politics and the real estate and the power plays, as I said, that were really ruling the ground zero process. And that was, in fact, the most important subject of his tenure. And I think he struggled to really get at the heart of the matter, even when he was writing quite regularly, despite, as I said, his persuasiveness and real eloquence in writing about other subjects and other buildings and other sites, other locations. Ada Louise had built up the particular expertise over those 5 decades that was needed to write about this rebuilding process, and particularly its politics and connection to power and real estate in New York. And that was true throughout her coverage, beginning, of course, in early 2002, as the earliest plans for rebuilding began to surface, and right through toward the end of her career and life, as we continue to wait for that One World Trade Center building to open. It should be open sometime next year, is what they tell me. And something similar with a twist happened in Ada Louise's coverage of the Barnes Foundation, the new Barnes Foundation building in Philadelphia. She had been dubious, as I have been, of the plan to move the Barnes, to relocate it, and to commission a new home for it by the architects Todd Williams and Billy Chen. And she had written quite critically and quite forcefully about that plan and the faults of it as she saw them. And then the building opened, and again, we all rushed to write the first pieces, and I think I may actually have had the first review of the Barnes Foundation, and I was quite negative about it. And then other critics weighed in, positively and negatively, and in between. And then some time passed, and the dust settled. And then Ada Louise's piece appeared, in which she admitted to a remarkable change of heart. And this is also a piece that's worth seeking out if you haven't read it. She admitted that walking through the building and seeing the completed product had completely changed her mind. Let me read a little bit from that review. I take history and authenticity seriously. And she wrote that because one of the very odd things about the new Barnes is that the architects were required to create replicas of the old galleries. So the larger building that wraps those galleries is completely new, and the architects had a good deal of freedom to create that new exterior. But inside, in the center of the museum, the galleries had to be replicated. And that was actually something that was part of the legal decision giving the Barnes Foundation permission to move to Philadelphia from its formerly suburban location in Marion. And Ada Louise, in her book, The Unreal America, and many of her pieces of criticism had been very strongly dubious of that kind of effort to recreate old architecture, to make a new building that was supposed to be masquerading as an old one. And yet something about the Williams and Chen design swayed her. So she wrote, I take history and authenticity seriously. I have never disguised my defense of originality over copies, or my distaste for the Disneyfication of reality, or the more genteel, and she put this in quotes, authentic reproduction, an oxymoron that devalues the creative and the creative act by glossing the knockoff with a false veneer of respectability. Because a foe is a phony by any other name. And I have been one of the most ardent defenders of the small personal museum that you remember with particular affection, as opposed to the awe inspired by the increasingly affectless grandeur of our enormous arts institutions that expand relentlessly as their price of admission rises? So up to then, the review is pretty much tracking what I had written a few weeks before, and then there's this remarkable turn where she writes, "So how does it feel to have one's core beliefs turned upside down? The new Barnes," again in quotes, "that contains the old Barnes," in quotes, "shouldn't work, but it does. It should be inauthentic, but it's not. It has changed, but it is unchanged. The architects have succeeded in retaining its identity and integrity without resorting to a slavishly literal reproduction. This is a beautiful building that does not compromise its contemporary convictions or upstage the treasures inside. And it isn't alchemy, it's architecture." So this is the last question to pose about Ada Louise and her legacy and the questions that this archive might answer. What can be learned in this age of instant digital communication, of critics on Twitter and Instagram and Tumblr and live blogging and live tweeting the events and sometimes even the buildings that they see? What can be learned from the more deliberate approach that Ada Louise practiced, I think so effectively late in her career, when she was just writing a handful of pieces every year for the Wall Street Journal? Did those later pieces have power simply because of the skill and critical authority that she had built up over 5 decades, or was there something about their timing, their critical distance, that made them even more thoughtful and even more powerful? I work for a newspaper, as she did, and of course we both had to traffic to an extent in newness. That was part of our job. That's what newspapers do. And it's difficult indeed, and not always appropriate, to argue with one's editors to buy that kind of time or for that kind of distance. But this final question about the pace of criticism, how much time critics take to deliver their points of view, and the counterintuitive influence a piece that can come by trailing rather than leading the news cycle can have, at least when it's as pointed and thoughtful as a review by Ada Louise Huxtable. This question, I think, has significant meaning for the whole culture, not just for architects and architecture critics. And it's one that I've been giving a lot of thought lately to as I have gone back to read many of those pieces from the Wall Street Journal from the last 10 to 15 years by Ada Louise. And I think it will be deeply helpful for a number of us to look into this archive to find out exactly how those late pieces, those deliberate and especially influential pieces came to be, and what lessons an architecture critic like me, who happens to be exactly the same age now that Ada Louise was when she started at the Times in 1963, might be able to learn from them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christopher. That was fantastic. Christopher has agreed to answer a few of the questions. And there are microphones coming around, and I see one hand up there. Wait for the microphone, please.
Do you ever do 2 reviews of the same building?
The question is, do I ever do 2 reviews of the same building? I have, and I'd like to do that more. And I think one thing architecture critics always struggle with is how, as I mentioned at the end of these remarks, how to convince our editors that going back to a building a second time is newsworthy. So I can tell you that the 10th anniversary of Disney Concert Hall is coming up in October. It opened in October of 2003. And I'll certainly revisit the building that time. I did so in 2007 on the 10th anniversary of the Getty, to revisit a design that I hadn't been around to write about when it opened in LA. I wasn't living here at the time. But that's a great deal of distance. I think your question is really, can you do it more without that much time passing? And I think I'm always looking for ways to do that. And not just with buildings. I mean, I think I was discussing with a number of folks from the Getty before we came down here this evening, this Mocha architecture show, which I'm just finishing up a review of that will appear most likely in Sunday's paper. And there's so many issues swirling around that show that it really probably will take a couple of pieces to get into all of them. I decided to write about it on Sunday because I wanted a little more space, a little more room to talk about those, but I think it will be impossible in a single piece to do it. So yes, I and other critics have really been looking for ways to revisit buildings, see, often we see a building before it opens, we see it sometimes on a tour with the architect, sometimes not, and the building is often empty when we go through. We're not seeing how people interact with it. We're not seeing how crowds are lining up at the elevators or not, or how people are moving through the galleries of a museum. And so just as an excuse to get back and see how buildings are used, I think it would be helpful to try to do that more than we have done. Yes? You want to wait for the mic? I think it's coming down. Tom.
Thank you. As you know, I share your admiration of Louise Huxtable. Her work has influenced me greatly. I can't think of many things to criticize about her work. I'm sure there are things that I would come up with. As you're going through it, are there issues, are there articles or works where you think even Ada Louise was wrong?
The question, a good one from Tom Hines is, are there places where I'm finding that even Ada Louise was wrong? And yeah, the answer is yes. I think there are a few buildings where there's a real critical split, and I think the Edward Durrell Stone's work is a good example. I do think that she was too hard on those some of those architects that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. Some of those pieces, I think the buildings, and that's one of the reasons I included that Ezra Stoller photograph. I think the Hirshhorn has more virtues than she gave it credit for as a piece of architecture. So yes, there are times when our views differ, and we differed on the fate of the not just the original stone building at 2 Columbus Circle, but also the plan to replace it. So those of you who don't know that story, it was in a designed by the Portland architect Brad Klopfel. The original building was sort of wrapped in a new concrete skin, and Klopfel's scheme sort of traced a new glazing pattern along the facade in a process that he described as editing the original building by stone. And actually that quote, the piece that I quoted from where I was talking about how beautifully done the uppercut while stifling a yawn piece came from, actually it was just a blog post that I did, and we had an interesting, Ada Louise and I had an interesting correspondence about this, because Brad Klopfel had described the process of remaking 2 Columbus Circle as editing the original. I went back to Ada Louise's original review of the building, and I kind of annotated it. I sort of treated it the way that Brad Klopfel treated that old building, and I interspersed my own comments with her review, in part to really address head-on and in detail this incredibly influential piece of architectural criticism that I found paradoxically many people had never read beyond the lollipop line. And so in doing that, I found that I really did not agree with her take on the building, and then we had, as I said, a really interesting kind of email exchange about that. Yeah, so there are moments when I felt that, and I'm sure there will be more as I look at more of the pieces.
Oh, hi. Did you know her personally, and if so, what was your impression of her?
I met her only twice in person. The first time in New York at the preview of a MoMA exhibition on new architecture from Spain, and then we met again at a conference on postmodernism near the end of her life. And then we were email correspondence, and we would send each other notes about pieces that we liked that the other had done, and that was really the extent of it. My impression was that in person of a person who was of very small stature, but had a kind of toughness and personality and force that matched her prose style, I would say. She was not somebody you would have get the idea that you could mess with. She was tough in person too.
Yes, hi. You've shown a lot of terrific images in your presentation tonight, and it makes me wonder about her relationship with, or her views on, the architectural image, the rendering, the money shot, the ways in which the written word and the image interact, how they diverge. And I'm reminded of the final piece, the New York Public Library piece, where she's talking about this, practically begging to see the images or the drawings of the proposal. And I don't know if you have any knowledge through your knowledge of her work, her prior work, as to her views on that. Perhaps this is fertile ground for digging through the archives.
I think it is fertile ground. I think it's fertile ground for all of us going forward to think about what the power and ubiquity of the architectural rendering and the digital architectural photograph that can be instantly sent around the world, the effect that that's had on architecture. I mean, it came up for me in my review of the Morphosis Museum in Dallas, because I think it is a building not only that works much better in a photograph than in person, but is designed to take advantage and even exploit that fact, which is why I referred to it as cynical, which is not a word that I would throw around lightly. But I think there are architects who understand all too well the power of that imagery, and how many more people who experience their work now will do so via a screen of one kind or another. So the number of people who are looking at and getting knowledge of significant pieces of architecture, a huge majority of them, I think, are looking at, with some exceptions, the attendance at the Pro Museum is quite high, so that may be an exception, but in a lot of cases, more people are looking at those images digitally than are visiting the building in person. And so I think it's a dangerous kind of knowledge for architects to have. So she did, to answer your question, she wrote in the Unreal America and other projects about the idea of reproduction, of simulation, which is definitely related. I don't know that she wrote a particular piece on renderings, but she may have. It certainly came up in the New York Public Library piece, as you mentioned, and the little bit of backstory, the only backstory I know is that she mentions this in the review as well, it was pressing them to have access to see those images, and they were very reluctant to show her or anyone. And that's really what led to the kind of force, the power of that final review. But yes, I think it's absolutely fertile ground, not just in thinking about her work, but I just think it's something that critics and architects need to grapple with more than we have. Yes, in the middle there.
You spoke about the universal element of criticism. Louise Huxtable is associated with New York, and New Haven is far away from New York, or I'm sure a lot of New Yorkers to imagine her papers being. How is the Getty, and how do you see yourself helping New York interpret its history, maybe as far as New Haven, but
right.
She is so at her core a New Yorker.
No, it's absolutely true. She was born, grew up in New York, spent her whole career. The vast majority, of course, of what she's writing about is in New York. So as I said, I can understand the reaction of New Yorkers to losing the archive to the West Coast. I think that there will be plenty of New Yorkers who will be coming here to see it. Alexandra Lang, who I mentioned, I'm sure will be interested in, and New York critics will be. The archive itself, or studies of it? Yeah, I mean, that's a good question for the Getty. Well, I don't know, there's probably some, I think there are some plans to do some events in New York, correct?
The archive is being cataloged as we speak, we've started to work on it right away because we know that many people will want to get access to it. But it is a big archive, so it's going to take a few months before before it will be finished. So I cannot tell you exactly when it will be done. Once that cataloging is done, anybody anywhere in the world will be able to find out that we have this archive by going into online, searching Louise Huxtable, and they will find that there is a finding aid on our website, in our catalog, for this archive, where you can find out exactly what's in the archive. So we will open it up to anybody, and now with other archives also. I'm not worried about that people will come to see this archive. especially if people from the East Coast will want to come in the winter when it's nice here and not there.
And it's really true. I mean, even given her long association with the Getty, she didn't write a whole lot about Los Angeles. And Paul Goldberger, in fact, told me that when he started at the Times in his 20s, she told him that she had never been to Los Angeles at that point in her life and career. And he takes credit for convincing her about how much good work was going on out here, including the work of Frank Gehry and others, which she wound up writing quite positively about in later years. But yes, I think there will be a steady stream of scholars, historians, critics, architects who are interested in coming from New York to look at the papers.
Oh, hi. I just wanted to ask, given that she was from New York, did she ever critique the Getty Center here?
She did, most notably in an essay in a book published to coincide with the opening, which Jim Cuno actually quoted from at her memorial service. So that's she had one very long piece and then referred to it many times in subsequent years. And I think stuck with Richard Meyer longer in some ways than other critics did, even some of his other early champions.
Yes, there's another writer at the Los Angeles Times who featured prominently in a documentary about the Barnes Foundation, and I'm just curious to know, I assume you like the new building and the transferal, and you agree with Huxtable?
I'm sorry, which building?
The Barnes Foundation building, the new one that you're seeing on the screen here. And anyway, I was just curious to know if your paths cross with the art critic of the LA Times, and has he changed his opinion? As I assume you've, of course, seen the new building, and what is his current opinion?
Yes, actually, I disagreed with Ada Louise about the Barnes. I'm not a fan of the new building. So Christopher Knight, who's the art critic at the Times, and I agree on the building, and disagree with Ada Louise's take. I found it to be, as I said, the first couple paragraphs of her review before she makes that U-turn, I found myself nodding in agreement. I found that it really is shadowed by the sense of inauthenticity and the fact that you're in a simulacrum of these rooms, and it's hard to think of any case where this kind of new architecture that's meant to look old or simulate the old in some way actually works as a powerful piece of new architecture. But that's again where she and I departed on this particular project. Well, thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure to be here.